appear before you today. I look forward to your questions.
This is for that testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for questions. Director Wray, you testified before this committee 2 years ago that domestic terrorism threats were the most concerning terrorism threats in terms of lethality. More recently, you testified that the threats of domestic terrorism is metastasizing. Secretary Mayorkas, you testified before us earlier this year that domestic violent extremism represents the greatest threat in the homeland right now. Despite these acknowledgments, it appears that warning signs were disregarded or the domestic terrorism threat was not prioritized appropriately in the lead up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Director Wray and Secretary Mayorkas, what is your current assessment of threats posed by domestic terrorists to the homeland?
I'd be very pleased, Mr. Chairman, to answer that at the outset. We in the Department of Homeland Security, of course, with our partners across the federal government and state and local law enforcement, consider domestic violent extremism to be the most prominent terrorism-related threat to the homeland right now. I think our response in anticipation of what could have materialized on September 18th demonstrates the lessons learned from the January 6th insurrection. We gathered a great deal of intelligence and information from public-facing sources, as well as leveraging academic and other third-party institutions. We disseminated that information and intelligence to state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. We focused on the National Capital Region, and we were far more prepared should anything have materialized on September 18th than was previously the case, Mr. Chairman.
Director Wray.
Director Wray. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I would say a few things. First, starting back in June of 2019, I elevated racially and ethically motivated violent extremism to a national threat priority, which is our highest threat priority level. And I think that has already shown fruits in the fact that we have effectively doubled the number of domestic terrorism investigations and arrests since that time. We had about 180 domestic terrorism arrests last year. We've had over 600 now in connection with January 6th alone. I would say that we have also created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell to help increase the level of intelligence and information flow that goes out. Certainly from a lethality perspective, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, we have seen those kinds of domestic violent extremists responsible for the most lethal activity over recent years, although I would add that in 2020, we saw a significant uptick in lethal action and violence by anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists to go along with the racially motivated violent extremists. And from a perspective of pushing out intelligence, as we did before January 6th, we've been pushing out dozens of intelligence products to our federal, state, and local partners to highlight the threat.
Thank you much. Director Wray, Congress passed the Data Act. And as you know, we have been trying to make sure that the FBI produce information on domestic terrorism in a manner that not just members of Congress, but the public at large can understand what's going on. We finally got a report subject to the NDAA legislation, but there's still some gaps in terms of data missing from 2009 to 2019. Can you commit to helping close those data gaps in that report so that members of Congress and the public at large can have the understanding necessary about the growing problem with domestic terrorism in this country?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, you can count on us to work with you and your staff and the committee staff to try to produce more information, to be more responsive to those requests. Certainly, as I understand it, some of the information requested, and this gets overly involved for this setting, involves information that at least wasn't maintained in earlier years in the form that would be, I think, most useful. So we're trying to work through that with your staff. And certainly I recognize that the earlier report took longer to get to you than it should have. Some of that, in all fairness, was in part due to the pandemic and the fact that the people that we really needed to rely on for that work were both strained by the pandemic, but also working on the significant domestic terrorism caseload that, as I testified a few minutes ago, mushroomed last year. So we're going to work with you, and we will try to see if we can get you more complete information.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes as a ranking member of the full committee, gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Director Wray, it's nice to see you again.